Iron Fragility, the story of Eleanor Roosevelt, the reluctant First Lady. The White House remembers many lives, but it hardly knew anyone more contradictory and yet more inspiring than Eleanor Roosevelt. Her life was not so much a sequence of official events as it was a constant struggle, a woman's battle with pain, duty, and herself. Secrets, loss, and an inner strength that didn't always come from love, but was often forged from its absence. Sorrow in Gilded Rooms. Eleanor was born on October 11, 1884, into a world that seemed dazzling and secure. Her parents, Anna Hall and Elliot Roosevelt, were part of New York's elite, people who dined with silver and smiled on schedule. But even among gilded chandeliers and polished floors, Eleanor felt like a stranger. Her mother, a cold and stern beauty, didn't look at her daughter with love, but with disappointment, as if Eleanor's very presence disrupted the delicate harmony with her misplaced seriousness. Anna scorned Eleanor's appearance, calling her granny for her thoughtful gaze and restrained nature. And though the girl longed for warmth, all she heard were sighs of disapproval. Emotional abandonment was her first true lesson in life. The first cracks. At the age of 2, Eleanor nearly died. Her family was aboard the luxurious steamship SS Britannic when it collided with another vessel. Amid screams, panic, and the sea crashing against the hull, the little girl absorbed a terror so deep that she never forgot. The ocean might look calm, but danger lies beneath. From then on, ships and open water filled her with dread. But what followed on land was even worse. In 1892, her mother died. The next year, her younger brother succumbed to the same diphtheria. And just when it seemed she might have her father left, fate struck its final blow. Elliot, brother to President Theodore Roosevelt, was charming but broken by alcoholism. He would vanish and return in fits of remorse until he was finally sent to a sanitarium. There, plagued by hallucinations and madness, he jumped out of a window. He survived, but not for long. His heart gave out in 1894. Eleanor was just 10 years old. A letter before death. Before he died, her father made one final request, that she take care of her younger brother Hall. Eleanor took this as a vow, a sacred duty she never betrayed. By age 14, she already knew the cost of loss, the weight of promises. Her childhood burned out before it ever had a chance to shine. I am an ugly duckling, she thought, staring at her reflection in the mirror at her grandmother's house, where she'd been sent to live. In that home, full of rules and void of affection, she didn't fight the world. She fought herself. But even then, a flame lived in her, resistant to the winds of fading hope. At 14, she wrote a line she would live by: "Even the plainest woman, if truth and loyalty are written across her face, will be beautiful." Awakening, she escaped grim New York for a private European school. And there, far from familiar eyes, she blossomed. At Allenswood Academy, people noticed her. The teachers admired her mind, and the girls were drawn to her. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like a shadow. She felt like the sun. Her peers called her the soul of the school. She didn't fit traditional beauty standards, but she radiated dignity and warmth that drew others in like a magnet. But just as she found her wings, they were clipped once more. Her grandmother, who ruled the family beneath a glass dome of conservatism, called her back home. Returning to New York, where everything echoed with loss and disapproval, felt like a punishment. But she obeyed. Her life would prove again and again. Eleanor might bend, but she never broke. This is how Eleanor Roosevelt's journey began. A woman whose heart held pain, compassion, and a relentless desire to change the world, no matter the cost. She could barely stop her hands from trembling as she pulled on her gloves before her society debut. The long-anticipated debutante ball, a dream come true for most girls, felt to Eleanor like a nightmare in silk. After years abroad and tucked away in boarding schools, returning to New York's high society didn't feel like a celebration. Felt like a sentence. In that glittering world of forced smiles and mother-of-pearl fans, she felt like an outsider in her own skin. Later she would recall it was simply a terrible day. And yet, beneath the chandeliers and shallow curtsies, something ended, her lonely girlhood, and something else began. A love story that would change everything. Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered her life like a character out of a novel. They met on a train, a seemingly ordinary trip to Tivoli that turned into a step toward destiny. He was her distant cousin, a fifth cousin, but something in their first meeting sparked a quiet, genuine connection. Their letters soon became a secret bridge, spanning the chasm of social expectations, family politics, and, as it would soon become clear, his mother's wrath. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was not a woman to be defied. Her approval was courted, her disapproval feared. When she learned of Franklin's intentions to marry Eleanor, her fury was like ice, silent, chilling, and destructive. She forced him to keep the engagement secret for a full year, as if time could wear love down. But Franklin held firm. Sarah didn't give up. In 1904, she whisked Franklin away to the Caribbean, hoping distance would wash Eleanor from his heart. But he wasn't easily swayed. He returned with determination, and the wedding went ahead, against every silent obstacle. It was a grand affair fit for the pages of the New York Times, and indeed it made the front page. President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's uncle, walked her down the aisle in place of the father she had lost too soon. "It's a good thing to keep the name in the family," he quipped with a wink, and the room burst into laughter. It felt like the beginning of a bright, untouchable future. It felt safe. But Sarah would not be left in the past. The house she gifted to the newlyweds was a carefully wrapped trap. Sliding doors connected her living quarters to theirs, literally. She could step into their lives at any moment and often did without knocking. Not on doors, not on boundaries. It wasn't merely inconvenient. It was domination in disguise. Eleanor felt herself dissolving under the weight of someone else's will. "I live in a house that doesn't belong to me," she once told Franklin. It wasn't a metaphor. It was her plea. And like many pleas, it went unheard. When the children came, the pain only deepened. Eleanor gave birth, Sarah raised them. It wasn't just the babies she lost. It was the right to be a mother. Her eldest son, James, once recalled how his grandmother told him, "Your mother only gave birth to you. I am your real mother." The words may have been spoken gently, but they landed like a verdict. Under this pressure, Eleanor bent like a frostbitten branch. She endured not only control but isolation, even in the most intimate corners of her marriage. Despite bearing 6 children, she admitted to her daughter that she found no comfort in physical closeness with her husband. The marital bed, for her, was not a place of affection, but a test to be endured. There was no passion, only ritual, the quiet burden of duty. Eleanor Roosevelt was a hero, though she would never have called herself one. When Franklin Roosevelt's body was seized by illness and his legs stopped obeying him, their entire world trembled. His mother, Sarah, didn't hesitate. He had to give up politics. It was too painful, too risky. But Eleanor, quiet, reserved, nearly invisible until then, rose. She looked fear in the eye, stared into the uncertain future, and said no. Her voice, once barely audible, became firm. "You're not stepping down, Franklin. This country needs you." In that moment, she became both anchor and wing, holding him steady, yet pushing him to rise. And that was when her own transformation began. After years spent in the shadows, under the heavy hand of her mother-in-law, under the weight of her name, under the suffocating invisibility of being just a wife, Eleanor straightened her back. Strength came through pain. At first, she simply stood in for Franklin at public events, speaking where he couldn't appear. But with every handshake, every speech, she realized this wasn't just his stage. It was hers, too. Sarah no longer called the shots. A new force emerged in their home, Eleanor. And she wasn't silent anymore. She was stubborn, alive, full of empathy, and driven by a hunger for change. But politics is no stroll through a sunny garden. In the roaring 1920s, Eleanor found herself in the eye of a political storm, caught between her husband and her cousin, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who became entangled in the infamous Teapot Dome scandal over oil leases. When Franklin publicly condemned the affair, it turned their family dinners into battlegrounds. Theodore snapped back, dismissing Franklin as a maverick, an outsider unworthy of the Roosevelt name. For Eleanor, it was personal. She couldn't forgive him, didn't want to. Instead, she struck back with wit and boldness. During Theodore's campaign tour, Eleanor followed him around in a car topped with a giant teapot, a pointed nod to the scandal. People laughed. Cameras flashed. Theodore lost the election by 105,000 votes. Eleanor didn't gloat, but this was more than a win over a grudge. It was a declaration. She would no longer be silent, no longer stand in the background. She was a political force, and the world would have to reckon with her. Yet Eleanor's heart had its own path to follow. By the 1930s, her marriage with Franklin had shifted. They were allies, partners in purpose, but no longer lovers. Affection had faded. Intimacy was gone. And then, quietly, almost by accident, Eleanor met someone who stirred in her feelings she hadn't known in years. Lorena Hickok, a sharp-tongued, fiercely independent journalist. There was something about her, something that caught Eleanor immediately. They became close, and then something more. Eleanor wrote her letters, long, warm, yearning for closeness. "I want to hold you, kiss you on the corner of your mouth." These weren't just words. They were full of longing, of tenderness, of a love that was forbidden, dangerous, and deeply real. On the day of Franklin's inauguration in 1933, Eleanor wore a sapphire ring given to her by Lorena, a private symbol held close to her skin, a quiet reminder of who she truly was. Being yourself can be dangerous. J. Edgar Hoover, the powerful head of the FBI, despised Eleanor Roosevelt. To him, she was a threat, too liberal, too independent, too unpredictable. He kept a file on her that eventually reached over 3,000 pages. He tracked her letters, her intimate connection with journalist Lorena Hickok. He wanted to use it all as ammunition, but Eleanor didn't hide. Not her feelings, not her beliefs. Yes, she helped Lorena get a job nearby, not for ambition but to be close. Historians still debate the physical nature of their bond, but there's no doubt about what they shared. Something deep, something real, something tender. At times, it was the only true light in Eleanor's life. She was the first lady, but not in any traditional sense. She was a woman searching for love, fighting for justice, defending the vulnerable, and refusing to be boxed in. Her love may have sparked gossip, and her choices may have seemed bold, even reckless, but she stayed true to what mattered: her heart and her conscience. This was only the middle of her journey. But even then, it was clear Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't just a name. She was a force. When you're betrayed, the world falls apart. But when you betray yourself, it's you who crumbles. Eleanor Roosevelt knew both kinds of pain all too well. In the late 1920s, as winds of change began to stir in America, a man entered her life. Not a politician, not an intellectual, but a quiet, dependable bodyguard named Earl Miller. He was in his 30s, she was in her 40s. They came from different worlds, yet something between them clicked. He taught her to ride horses, swim, even box. Around him, she laughed like a girl who hadn't yet learned that first ladies weren't supposed to laugh like that. Some biographers call it her first true love. They wrote to each other constantly, pages filled with warmth, trust, and unspoken understanding. Earl became what her marriage lacked: someone who listened, who felt, who never demanded, never betrayed. And Franklin, In that household, betrayal was quiet, but mutual. He had his own emotional anchor, his secretary, Missy Luhand. She wasn't just staff. She was his confidant, his secret companion. But this wasn't a scandal, not a melodrama. Their marriage had evolved into something else. Political, moral, almost sibling-like. They no longer expected love from one another, but they gave each other something perhaps rarer: unshakable support. To his credit, Franklin never stood in Eleanor's way, and her rise was nothing short of remarkable. When she first entered the White House, she felt trapped, like a bird in a gilded cage. The idea of being a smiling symbol terrified her. She had no interest in teacups and photo ops. Instead, she chose action and shook the country to its core. She became the first lady to speak publicly from the podium, boldly addressing audiences where women had once been expected to sit and listen. She didn't just give speeches. She wrote a daily newspaper column, My Day, Read Across America. She hosted radio shows. She earned more than her husband, the sitting president, bringing in $75,000 a year, most of which she gave to charity. Because she understood having a voice as a woman comes at a price. Her voice rang out, clear, unwavering, and, when needed, loud. Especially when she spoke for those no one else seemed to hear. Black Americans, workers, the poor. When the Daughters of the American Revolution denied singer Marian Anderson the right to perform at Constitution Hall, simply because she was black, Eleanor Roosevelt didn't just resign from the organization in protest. She took it further. With her support, Anderson gave a concert in front of the Lincoln Memorial under open skies. That day, as her voice soared over Washington like a hymn of hope, Eleanor stood behind the scenes. But the triumph was deeply hers. Eleanor never flinched from being inconvenient. When her friendship with black educator Mary McLeod Bethune deepened into a powerful alliance, Eleanor personally escorted her into the White House to ensure no one dared insult her. She later appointed Bethune to lead the Division of Negro Affairs in the National Youth Administration, and the backlash was immediate. In the South, Eleanor became nearly a persona non grata. But she did not retreat. In 1943, racial violence erupted in Detroit. Eleanor was blamed, accused of fueling unrest. Newspapers called for her silence. But she refused to be quiet, and something remarkable happened. People who had never before seen a first lady as an ally began to listen. Black voters, laborers, women, they heard her voice, and it mattered. On that crossroads of emotion, politics, and personal conviction, Eleanor Roosevelt was quietly forging a new kind of womanhood one America had never seen before. Hers was not the story of a perfect lady, but of a real human being. A person who felt deeply, failed at times, hurt, but never gave up. And maybe that, more than anything, was her greatest victory. She didn't back down. December 7th, 1941, the day America shook. That morning, the skies over Pearl Harbor exploded, and with them, the nation was thrust into World War II. Radios crackled with terrifying news. Families clung to every word, stunned. But while most felt fear, others suddenly found themselves targeted. Japanese Americans, many of them born and raised in the U.S., became scapegoats. The public wanted vengeance, not justice. Eleanor Roosevelt could not remain silent. As patriotism blurred into prejudice, she stood not with a flag, but with the voice of conscience. In her diary, she warned of what she called a great hysteria against minorities. As so often in her life, she saw what others refused to see, and spoke when others stayed quiet. And inside the Roosevelt home, the air grew cold. When Franklin, her husband, the president, her partner in life and politics, signed the executive order establishing internment camps, it broke something in her. Not just as a wife, but as a citizen. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned for nothing more than their ancestry. Eleanor knew the cost of speaking out. The Los Angeles Times bluntly declared it was time to push her out of public life. Still, she stood her ground. She hadn't come this far to lower her head now. And she didn't. Against the wind, she didn't just challenge public opinion. She challenged the White House itself. Eleanor Roosevelt's heart broke for those clinging to life beyond America's borders. Refugees, Jews, the persecuted swept aside by the rising tide of Nazism in Europe. She pleaded with Franklin, "Open the doors, let them in." But the doors stayed shut. Under pressure from fear and politics, her husband tightened immigration quotas. Eleanor took it as a personal loss. Years later, their son James would quietly say in an interview, it was her deepest regret. She hadn't managed to persuade him, hadn't managed to save more lives. And maybe that's what she carried inside her until the end. Not the bitterness of losing a political battle, but the agony of not being able to change the course of fate for others. When the past returns on April 12, 1945, the world collapsed again. Franklin Roosevelt died of a stroke in Warm Springs, and with him, it felt as though an entire era came to an end. But for Eleanor, something more personal and painful began that day. There was a woman by his side when he died. Not just a guest, but a ghost from the ruins of their marriage. Lucy Mercer. To understand how deeply this cut, you have to go back to the autumn of 1918. Eleanor had been sorting through Franklin's belongings when she found the letters, hands trembling as she read them. Declarations of love, longing, kisses, all for someone else. Lucy. It wasn't a dramatic heartbreak. It was a stillness, a silence. Franklin had wanted to leave her, but he didn't. His mother and advisors convinced him it would mean the end of his political career. Eleanor stayed, but she was never the same. Still, betrayal doesn't fade. Years after Franklin's death, their daughter Anna confessed that she'd known. She'd helped arrange meetings between Franklin and Lucy. Everyone, the children, the staff, even his own mother, had kept the truth from Eleanor. It wasn't just deception. It was loneliness stretched across decades. But she had her secrets, two behind Eleanor's poised speeches, her tireless travel, her visits to prisons and hospitals. There was another life, one that wasn't printed in newspapers. But those close to her suspected. Earl Miller, her bodyguard, was someone special. They wrote letters, walked together, shared silences. No one knows what those letters contained. Maybe they spoke of pain, of loyalty, of the trust she so often lacked. After her death, all of their correspondence vanished. Forever. Skeletons and the mirror. Eleanor was no saint. Like anyone, she carried her flaws. In her younger years, early in the 20th century, she once said something that would later haunt her. A Jewish party is a horror. She had grown weary of the pearls, furs, and shallow elite circles of New York society, where money and lineage too often defined worth. But that remark remained. A trace of the world she came from, and the very world she would later spend her life fighting against. Because Eleanor changed. She listened, she learned, and she went where it hurt to try and help. The story of Eleanor Roosevelt is not that of a flawless heroine. It is the story of a woman who, in a world full of silence and lies, chose to speak the truth. Even when her voice trembled, she was a woman of her time, and a woman who reshaped that time. But no one walks into the light without passing through darkness first. Eleanor Roosevelt. Sensitive, difficult, passionate, and deeply human. Didn't become the voice of conscience overnight. She had her blind spots, her mistakes, her prejudices. But it's the journey from shadow to light that makes her story so powerfully human. Once, in the early 1900s, she co-owned the elite Todhunter School for Girls in New York. Back then, her worldview still bore the prejudices of her class. She voiced concerns about admitting too many Jewish students, saying they were too unlike us. Today, those words sound chilling. But at the time, they reflected not hatred, but unawareness. Eleanor was still learning to see in others the same human dignity that would later become her most powerful weapon. And she learned, and she changed. The years, the pain she endured, and the Great War turned her world upside down. Surrounded by a new circle of friends, fighters for justice and equality, immigrants, activists, she became someone else. By the time World War II began, Her heart was already beating in sync with those who suffered. The exiled, the rejected, the displaced. She wrote articles, aided refugees, and spoke out boldly against fascism and in defense of Jewish rights. The woman who once clung to the familiar transformed into a woman willing to break the familiar for the sake of truth. It wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a journey. And that journey, that growth, that's what makes her so deeply real. But nothing lasts forever. Even the strongest spirit must one day yield to a body that can no longer carry the weight of time. In 1960, she was struck by a car on a New York City street, an injury from which she never fully recovered. Doctors diagnosed her with aplastic anemia. Her body could no longer produce enough new blood cells, and week by week, she grew weaker. Still, she pressed on, working, writing, meeting with people as best she could. But her body was fading. Then came another blow. Tuberculosis, long dormant in her bones, suddenly awakened. It was the beginning of the end. On November 7, 1962, at the age of 78, Eleanor Roosevelt's heart stopped. But what died was only her body. Everything else remained. Her battles, her transformation, her struggles with herself and with the world. They live on in the thousands she inspired, because she was one of those rare people who proved, you can be wrong, you can be blind, but what truly matters is the courage to change, and to move toward the light, even when the path is hard.